The next theme for my stories is entitled Ghost Encounters. The first story, subtitled Do You Believe Now? I was always a skeptic when it came to the supernatural. I believed everything had a logical explanation. Ghosts, spirits, entities, those were things for movies and campfire stories, not real life. But this experience shook that belief to its core and forced me to question what I thought I knew about reality. It was a red-eye flight from Los Angeles to Fort Lauderdale. We were operating one of the smaller aircraft in our fleet, so there were only 3 flight attendants on board. The flight wasn't completely full, and a few seats were empty. About 3 hours into the nearly 6-hour flight, service had been completed and most of the passengers were asleep. I was sitting in the back of the aircraft on my jump seat, flipping through the latest issue of People magazine that a passenger had left behind. The flight attendant working with me in the back was chatting non-stop about her boyfriend of 4 months and her elaborate scheme to convince him to propose. I nodded along politely, like any jump seat therapist would. Meanwhile, the lead flight attendant was alone in the front galley, working on a crossword puzzle he's been carrying around for the last 2 trips. Everything was quiet. Then a passenger walked to the back of the plane and said to me, "It's freezing by my seat." I told her I would check the temperature. She then headed into the lavatory. When she walked away, the other flight attendant and I exchanged a classic eye roll. Every flight attendant has that one passenger who is always freezing on every aircraft. The passenger then returned to her seat. About 10 minutes later, another passenger approached me. "It's freezing back at my seat," she said. Now I started to think maybe the cabin temperature was a little low. It was time for my 10-minute cabin walk through anyway, so I grabbed a trash bag and headed up the aisle. When I reached row 18, I felt a cold unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just cold air, it was deep, bone-chilling cold. The kind that seeps into your body. When I exhaled, I could actually see my breath forming condensation in the air. The 2 women who had complained were lying across the seats in row 18, one on each side of the aisle. They had pulled nearly everything from their carry-on bags and layered it in an attempt to stay warm. I asked the passengers seated in the row in front of them, "Are you guys cold?" They looked confused. "No," one of them said, "we're actually pretty warm." I then asked the passengers behind them in row 18. They said they were warm as well. So now only one row on the entire aircraft was freezing. Of course, I began to investigate. I checked the air vents in the passenger service unit, completely closed. I ran my hands along the fuselage panels trying to find where this cold air was coming from. Nothing. There was no airflow. The freezing air was simply sitting in row 18. I told the 2 women I would notify the lead flight attendant so she could inform the captain. When I reached the front galley, I explained the situation. The lead said the captain was about to step out of the cockpit for a lavatory break and that I could have him take a look. When the captain came out, I explained what was happening. He looked at me like I wasn't the brightest apple in the bunch. So I told him, "Go see for yourself." He walked down to row 18, checked a few things, then returned looking unusually thoughtful. He said what was happening was virtually impossible. The aircraft had 2 air conditioning packs, one in the front and one in the back. There was no scenario where a single row could freeze while the rest of the aircraft remained normal. He said maybe there was some issue with air conditioning system he was not aware of, but nothing in the cockpit indicates a malfunction or pressure problem. He said he'll have maintenance check it out when we landed at Fort Lauderdale. Then he returned to the cockpit. A few minutes later, the lead flight attendant went to investigate. He asked me to remain in the front galley while he went back there. When he returned, he looked visibly shaken. I asked him what happened. He said that years earlier he had gone on a spiritual retreat in Tibet, and that experience allowed him to tap into his spiritual awareness. While he was explaining this, I was there thinking, don't tell me you're one of those people who believes in ghosts and the boogeyman. Then he said something that made me pause. He told me he felt an entity in row 18. At that point, I grabbed another trash bag and walked to the back of the cabin. I gave the two women hot tea and asked if they would like to move somewhere warmer. They declined. They didn't want to lose the empty road they had to themselves, so they stayed. I told the flight attendant in the back what the captain had said. She then went forward to talk to the lead, who shared his theory about the quote-unquote entity. And of course, she believed him. For the remainder of the flight, she stayed in the back galley, praying while clutching a religious necklace. The lead remained in the front galley. The furthest he ventured into the cabin was the exit row before turning right back around. I was the only one walking to and fro the cabin. I was convinced that there had to be a logical explanation. We landed in Fort Lauderdale just before dawn without incident, and passengers began to deplane. The two women from row 18 were the last ones off the aircraft. They took a while gathering their belongings because they had emptied their bags trying to layer themselves during the flight. The other flight attendant and I stood behind them with our luggage, subtly trying to hurry them along. Then we noticed something. As the women walked up the aisle, the cold air was following them. Sunlight was streaming through the aircraft windows, and in the light we could see it clearly, a mist, moving, shaped like a figure, walking slowly behind them. Every hair on my body stood on end. The other flight attendant and I looked at each other, then looked back at the misty figure gliding up the aisle. Without another word, we both dropped our bags, jumped over them, and ran back to the back of the plane, screaming our heads off. We huddled together beside the R2 door, waiting. Moments later, we heard another loud scream from the front galley when the woman passed. None of us tried to investigate. That's how people get killed in the movies. We stayed right where we were, shaking, for about 10 minutes, until the L2 door suddenly burst open and a flood of sunlight poured into the cabin. We screamed again, nearly giving the caterers a heart attack. With the cabin now filled with light, we decided it was safe enough to deplane. We cautiously followed behind the caterers as they walked up the aisle. When we reached the front galley, the lead flight attendant was gone. The other flight attendant and I sprinted off the plane and down the jet bridge. We asked the gate agent if she had seen the lead flight attendant. She said he ran out of the jet bridge like a bat out of hell. When we told her what happened, she said that explained the sudden cold draft she felt when the two passengers walked past her. The other flight attendant and I said our goodbyes and promised we would pray for each other. That was the last time I ever saw her. She died a year later. I never saw the lead again either. I don't even know if he still works for the airline. But that flight changed me. It made me realize that there are things in the spiritual world that exist beyond our understanding. And that experience happened only 3 years into my career as a flight attendant. There were other encounters after that. If you want to hear about them, come back to my page.